What are you doing here?
I had to see you.
You can't just show up.
It's important. Listen closely, my child.
Yes, I am listening.
Follow your heart.
I will.
You won't believe what I just saw. What? Tell us.
We have to do something.
What happened?
It's serious.
You have disgraced this family.
I am sorry, Mother. Forgive me.
Sorry is not enough. You must learn.
Yes, Mother.
The night was quiet in the village, the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel louder than it should. A lantern flickered in the wind, casting long shadows across the mud walls of a small family compound. Inside one of the huts, a young woman lay awake, her eyes open, her heart heavy. She had learned that in some homes, love does not arrive with marriage. Sometimes it comes wrapped in silence, jealousy, and a smile that hides sharp intentions. This is not just a story about a mother-in-law and her son's wife. It is a story about power, pain, endurance, and the price of cruelty that refuses to let go, even until death. In many African folktales, elders are seen as protectors of wisdom and tradition. Mothers are respected, their words carrying weight in the family and community. But what happens when that respect is used as a weapon? What happens when a mother's love for her son turns into hatred for the woman he chooses? This story begins with such a question, deep and uncomfortable, one that echoes through generations. It begins with a young man who followed his heart, and a woman who believed marriage would give her a home. The son was known in the village as gentle and hard-working. He was not rich, but his hands were strong and his heart was honest. When he brought his wife home, people whispered that she was too quiet, too soft, too different. She greeted everyone with respect, bending low, speaking gently, trying to learn her place. She believed that patience could win love, and that kindness would soften even the hardest heart. What she did not know was that some hearts grow harder when faced with someone pure. From the very first day, the mother-in-law watched her closely. Her eyes followed every step, every movement, every breath. To outsiders, she appeared calm and welcoming. But behind closed doors, her words were sharp, her silence louder than insults. She corrected everything, the way the young wife cooked, the way she walked, the way she spoke to her husband. Nothing was ever right. Each mistake, real or imagined, became another reason for punishment. The young wife tried to please her. She woke before sunrise and slept long after nightfall. She carried water, washed clothes, cooked meals, and kept the compound clean. When she was tired, she said nothing. When she was insulted, she lowered her head. She told herself that endurance was part of marriage, that suffering was temporary, that love would grow in time. But cruelty, when fed daily, only grows stronger. Her husband noticed the changes slowly. The laughter she once carried faded. Her eyes lost their shine. When he asked what was wrong, she smiled and said she was fine. She did not want to stand between a mother and her son. She did not want to be called disrespectful or ungrateful. In many homes, a woman's pain is expected to be silent. And so she carried it alone. The mother-in-law, however, was not satisfied. Control was not enough. She wanted dominance. She wanted the young wife to feel small, powerless, and afraid. She accused her of things she did not do. She blamed her for things beyond her control. If food burned, it was her fault. If the son returned home late, it was her influence. If sickness entered the house, her name was mentioned in whispers. Slowly, the air around the young wife became heavy, filled with suspicion and fear. Villagers began to notice. Some pitied her, others stayed away. No one wanted trouble with an elder known for her sharp tongue and strong influence. The young wife's family lived far away, and she felt trapped between duty and survival. Nights became longer. Her body grew weaker. Still, the torment did not stop. In fact, it seemed to grow worse with time, as though the mother-in-law was racing against something unseen. In African storytelling, we often say that evil does not always shout. Sometimes it speaks softly with a calm voice and a familiar face. Sometimes it hides behind tradition and authority. This story explores that dark truth. It asks how far cruelty can go when no one stands up to stop it. It asks what happens when endurance is mistaken for weakness, and silence is taken as permission. As the seasons changed, so did the young wife's fate. Her health began to fail and strange rumors started to spread. The mother-in-law's words carried more weight now, and the young wife's voice grew weaker each day. The son stood at the center of it all, torn between loyalty and love, unaware of how close the storm really was. And just when it seemed that the suffering could not go any further, something happened. Something that would change the course of this family forever. A secret whispered in the dark. A decision made in silence. A final act of torment that no one expected but everyone would remember. What the mother-in-law did next would push this story beyond cruelty and into tragedy. But before we go there, before the truth fully unfolds, we must pause here. Because what happened next was not just about hatred. It was about consequences. And the shadow of that choice would follow them all the way to the end. The days that followed felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened around the young wife. She moved through the compound like a shadow, doing her chores quietly, careful not to draw attention. Every step she took seemed to anger her mother-in-law even more. If she greeted her, she was accused of pretending. If she stayed silent, she was called proud. There was no safe path, no right choice. It was as if the older woman had already decided her fate, and now she was simply acting it out, slowly and painfully. Long before the marriage, the mother-in-law had imagined a different life for her son. She wanted a wife she could control completely, someone who would never question her authority or take her place in her son's heart. When the young woman arrived, gentle and respectful, the mother saw not kindness but competition. Every smile her son gave his wife felt like an insult. Every moment they shared felt like a betrayal. In her mind, love was something to be guarded, not shared. The young wife sensed this, but she did not understand it fully. She grew up believing elders should be honored no matter what. Her own mother had told her that patience could calm storms and silence could protect dignity. So she swallowed her tears and prayed quietly at night, asking for strength, asking for peace. Sometimes she dreamed of her old home, where laughter came easily and rest was not earned through pain. Waking up was always harder than falling asleep. Her husband began to notice more clearly now. He saw the way his wife flinched at his mother's voice. He noticed how she avoided the main hut unless necessary. He saw the weight she carried in her eyes. When he tried to speak to his mother, she dismissed him with anger. She reminded him of all she had done for him, all the sacrifices she had made. She accused him of choosing a stranger over his own blood. Each conversation ended with him feeling guilty, confused, and torn apart. In the village, rumors grew like weeds. Some said the young wife was cursed. Others whispered that she was stubborn and refused to obey her mother-in-law properly. A few brave voices tried to defend her, but they were quickly silenced. The mother-in-law's reputation was strong, her words sharp and convincing. People feared being dragged into family matters that could turn ugly. Silence became the community's shield, and the young wife was left alone inside it. As her strength faded, the tasks did not lessen. If anything, they increased. She was sent on long walks under the hot sun, asked to do work beyond her strength, and blamed when her body failed her. When she fell sick, the mother-in-law called it laziness. When she struggled to eat, she was accused of being ungrateful. There was no mercy, only constant pressure, like a rope tightening around her spirit. At night, strange things began to happen. The young wife would wake suddenly, her heart racing, feeling as though she was being watched. Sometimes she heard whispers outside the hut, soft but threatening. Other times she found items moved or missing, small things meant to confuse and frighten her. She said nothing, afraid she would not be believed. Fear settled deep inside her, quiet but powerful. Her husband, unaware of the full extent of what was happening, traveled often for work. Each time he left, the mother-in-law's behavior grew worse. It was as if his absence gave her freedom. The young wife counted the days until his return, holding on to hope like a fragile thread. But even when he was home, the mother-in-law played her role well, switching faces with ease. To him she was caring and concerned. To his wife she was cold and relentless. The tension in the home became unbearable. Meals were eaten in silence. The sound of footsteps brought fear instead of comfort. The young wife's body grew weaker, but her mind stayed alert, constantly searching for ways to survive another day. She wondered if anyone would notice if she disappeared. She wondered if suffering quietly was truly the right path, or if it was slowly destroying her. One evening, an argument broke out between the mother and son. Voices rose, and the compound seemed to hold its breath. The young wife listened from a distance, her heart pounding. She could not hear every word, but she felt the anger, the bitterness, the years of control slipping out through harsh sentences. When the argument ended, the mother-in-law's eyes were darker than before. She looked at the young wife in a way that sent a chill through her bones. From that night on, everything changed. The mother-in-law became quieter, almost calm. Her insults softened, her commands fewer. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like peace had finally arrived. But the young wife felt something was wrong. The silence was too heavy, too deliberate. It felt like the quiet before a storm, the kind that does not warn before it strikes. Deep inside, the young wife sensed that whatever was coming next would not be something she could endure with patience alone. And as the moon rose over the village, casting pale light over the compound, a hidden plan continued to grow, one rooted in jealousy, control, and a darkness that refused to release its grip. The calm that followed did not bring relief. Instead, it unsettled everyone in the compound. The mother-in-law moved more slowly now, speaking less, watching more. Her eyes lingered on the young wife in a way that made her skin crawl. It was not the open anger she had grown used to, but something colder, more deliberate. The young wife felt as though she was being measured, studied, as if every breath she took was being counted. From the mother-in-law's point of view, she believed she was finally taking back control. In her mind, the household had been slipping from her hands since her son married. She felt ignored, replaced, and feared the day her son would no longer seek her advice. To her, the young wife was not just a person but a threat to her authority and identity. The silence she adopted was not peace, it was strategy. She had decided that words were no longer enough. The young wife noticed small changes. Her food tasted different sometimes, bitter in a way she could not explain. When she asked questions, she was met with a calm smile and told not to imagine things. Her water pot was once found cracked and she was blamed for being careless. Each incident felt small on its own, but together they created a pattern that filled her with quiet fear. She began to eat less, drink carefully, and trust no one fully. One afternoon, an elderly neighbor stopped by while the mother-in-law was away. She watched the young wife struggle to lift a heavy pot and shook her head. In a low voice, she warned her that not all battles are fought loudly, and not all enemies show their teeth. The young wife wanted to speak, to pour out everything she had been holding inside, but fear sealed her lips. She simply nodded, knowing deep down that the warning was already too late. The husband, caught between work and family, sensed the growing distance in his home. When he tried to talk to his wife, she avoided his eyes. When he tried to comfort her, she smiled weakly and said she was only tired. He felt frustrated and helpless, unsure of who to believe. His mother's calm behavior confused him. She spoke kindly now, reminding him to take care of his wife, asking about his work, acting like the loving mother everyone expected. Doubt crept into his heart, slowly pushing away his earlier concerns. At night, the young wife lay awake listening to the sounds of the village. Dogs barking in the distance, wind moving through the trees, footsteps passing near the hut. Sleep came in short moments, broken by dreams filled with dark water and heavy shadows. She felt her strength leaving her bit by bit, not just from her body but from her spirit. Still, she held on, believing that surviving one more day was an act of courage. The mother-in-law, meanwhile, began visiting a distant relative known for strange knowledge and quiet rituals. She left early in the morning and returned late, saying nothing about where she had been. Villagers noticed but did not ask questions. In many places, people learn not to interfere with matters they do not understand. The young wife only noticed that after these visits, the air around the older woman felt heavier, filled with an unspoken tension. Another subplot unfolded quietly within the village. A young girl who fetched water often crossed paths with the young wife. She noticed the changes, the weight loss, the tired eyes. One day she overheard part of a conversation between the mother-in-law and someone else, words spoken in hushed tones. She did not understand everything, but what she heard frightened her enough to keep her awake that night. She wanted to warn someone, but fear held her back just like it held everyone else. As weeks passed, the young wife's health worsened. She moved slower, breathed harder, and often felt dizzy. The mother-in-law used this as proof that something was wrong with her, whispering to her son that maybe his wife had hidden sickness or bad luck. The son felt torn apart, watching the woman he loved fade while his mother's voice filled his head with doubt. He promised himself he would seek help soon, unaware of how little time might be left. The tension inside the compound became almost visible. Conversations felt forced. Smiles felt fake. Even the walls seemed to listen. The young wife began keeping quiet records in her mind, remembering every look, every word, every strange event. She did not know why, only that something inside her told her these details mattered. Survival had sharpened her senses, even as her body weakened. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky red, the mother-in-law called the young wife to her side. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. Too gentle. The young wife hesitated before standing up, her heart beating fast. She felt that familiar chill, the warning that had never left her. As she walked toward the older woman, she did not know that this moment would mark a turning point, one that would push the hidden conflict closer to a breaking point. And somewhere in the distance, unseen but deeply connected, The consequences of long-held hatred were already beginning to move. The mother-in-law's voice that evening was calm, almost kind, and that was what frightened the young wife the most. She was asked to sit, to rest, to listen. Words that once carried sharp edges now came wrapped in softness. The older woman spoke about family, about endurance, about how life tests women before rewarding them. The young wife nodded slowly, her hands folded, her heart racing. Every instinct inside her screamed that this calm was not forgiveness but preparation. In the days that followed, the compound felt like it was holding its breath. The mother-in-law took over certain tasks herself, insisting the young wife rest. To outsiders it looked like concern. To the young wife, it felt like being watched even more closely. Meals were brought to her instead of shared. Drinks were prepared without her seeing how. Each act of kindness felt heavy, like a gift with hidden weight attached. She ate carefully, always leaving some food untouched, unsure why but trusting her fear. The husband noticed the change too, but in a different way. He felt relief. He believed the storm had finally passed, that his mother had accepted his wife at last. Seeing his wife resting more gave him hope. Yet he could not ignore how thin she had become, how her strength did not return. At night, he held her hand and promised that things would get better soon. She smiled weakly, wishing she could believe him without doubt. Meanwhile, whispers spread quietly through the village. The elderly neighbor who once warned the young wife began asking careful questions. The young girl who fetched water avoided the compound, her fear growing with each passing day. Something was wrong, but no one could name it out loud. In many African folktales, danger is often seen before it is understood. This felt like one of those moments. The mother-in-law continued her visits away from home, returning late and saying little. When she did speak, her words carried confidence, as if she was certain of an outcome no one else could see. She watched her son closely now, measuring his movements, listening to his tone. She feared he might act too soon, might interfere without knowing. Control to her meant timing. The young wife's nights grew more difficult. Sleep barely came, and when it did, it brought dreams that left her shaking. She dreamed of walking through thick fog, unable to see the path ahead, hearing her name called from different directions. She woke each morning exhausted, her body heavy, her chest tight. Still, she rose when asked, refusing to completely surrender. Survival had become her quiet rebellion. One afternoon, while the mother-in-law was away, the young wife gathered the courage to speak to her husband. Her voice was weak but steady as she told him she was afraid. She did not accuse directly, she only spoke of feelings, of unease, of not knowing who to trust anymore. The husband listened, troubled, his heart pulling him in two directions. Before he could respond, footsteps approached, and the conversation ended unfinished, hanging in the air like smoke. That night a storm rolled in. Thunder echoed across the village and rain beat hard against the roofs. The compound was dark, lit only by flashes of lightning. The mother-in-law moved through the rain without hesitation, her figure disappearing and returning like a shadow. The young wife watched from her hut, her breath shallow, sensing that something important was unfolding beyond her control. When the storm passed, the silence felt deeper than before. The mother-in-law entered the young wife's hut with a small bowl and a calm smile. She spoke softly, telling her to drink, to regain strength, to stop worrying. The young wife stared at the bowl, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it could be heard. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, every second heavy with choice and consequence. Elsewhere in the compound, the husband tossed in his sleep, uneasy without knowing why. The elderly neighbor sat awake, troubled by a feeling she could not explain. Even the night insects seemed quieter, as if nature itself was waiting. The young wife lifted the bowl slowly, her hands trembling, her mind racing through every warning, every fear, every silent prayer she had ever whispered. Just then, a distant sound broke the stillness. A call, faint but urgent, carried through the night air. The young wife froze, the bowl hovering between her hands. The mother-in-law's eyes darkened for a brief moment before her calm returned. Outside, footsteps hurried closer, and the fragile balance of the moment threatened to shatter. Whatever was about to happen would change everything. Years of silence, jealousy, endurance, and cruelty had led to this point. The storm had passed, but the real danger was only just beginning to show its face. And as the night pressed in around them, the question remained unanswered: who would reach the truth first, and who would pay the price? The sound outside grew clearer with every heartbeat. It was the voice of the young girl who fetched water, calling out in panic as she ran toward the compound. The young wife's hands shook so badly that a few drops spilled from the bowl onto the floor. The mother-in-law's calm cracked for a brief second, her jaw tightening before she forced a smile back onto her face. She told the young wife to drink quickly, saying the noise outside was nothing to worry about. But fear had already taken root too deeply to be ignored. The young wife lowered the bowl slightly, her mind racing. The girl's voice carried urgency, not the kind that came from gossip or play. It was a warning. Her heart beat harder, her instincts screaming louder than ever before. She pretended to cough, turning her face away, spilling more of the liquid onto the ground. The mother-in-law noticed, her eyes narrowing, her patience thinning. She reached forward, urging her again, her voice now firm beneath the softness. Outside, the young girl burst into the compound, breathless and shaking. She shouted the husband's name, drawing attention from nearby huts. She spoke of overheard words, of secret visits, of something dark being planned. Her sentences were broken, filled with fear, but they carried enough weight to stir the air. The husband rushed out, confusion turning quickly into alarm as he saw the panic on the girl's face. Inside the hut, the young wife froze. She could hear her husband's voice now, sharp with concern. The mother-in-law stood up slowly, placing the bowl aside as if nothing was wrong. Her face shifted again, this time into one of anger and offense. She accused the girl of lies, of disrespect, of trying to destroy a family. Her voice rose, cutting through the night, commanding attention. The tension spread like fire. Neighbors gathered, drawn by the shouting and the strange timing of it all. The elderly woman who once warned the young wife stood among them, her face pale. She looked from the mother-in-law to the hut, then to the young wife's trembling form inside. Pieces that once felt disconnected began to align in her mind, forming a picture too frightening to speak aloud. The husband stood torn, his eyes darting between his mother and the hut where his wife sat silently. Doubt flooded his face. The calm behavior he had trusted now felt forced, rehearsed. He stepped toward the hut, calling his wife's name gently. The mother-in-law moved quickly, blocking his path, insisting there was nothing to see, nothing to fear. Her voice shook just enough to reveal the cracks beneath her control. Inside, the young wife's strength began to fail her. The fear, the stress, the long weeks of suffering weighed heavily on her body. She leaned against the wall, her breath shallow, her vision blurring. She wondered if this moment was her last chance to be seen, to be believed. With effort, she stood and moved toward the doorway, each step feeling like a battle against the darkness pressing in. When she appeared, a hush fell over the compound. Her thin frame, her tired eyes, and her unsteady steps spoke louder than any accusation. Murmurs spread through the crowd. This was not the picture of a healthy, cared-for wife. This was the face of endurance stretched to its breaking point. The mother-in-law reacted quickly, placing a hand on her chest, claiming shock, claiming betrayal, claiming she had done everything out of love. But then, something unexpected happened. The young wife spoke. Her voice was weak, but it carried truth. She did not accuse loudly or angrily. She spoke of fear, of confusion, of not understanding why kindness felt dangerous. She spoke of strange changes, of silence that felt heavier than insults. Every word landed carefully, each one pulling at the attention of those listening. The mother-in-law laughed sharply, dismissing it all as sickness and imagination. Yet her hands trembled, and her eyes darted toward the bowl still sitting inside the hut. The elderly neighbor noticed. So did the young girl. So did the husband, whose heart now pounded with a mix of guilt and dread. He realized too late how much he had ignored. Just as the crowd began to whisper more boldly, another voice rose. A distant relative of the mother-in-law stepped forward, someone who had seen her visits, heard her words, and kept quiet out of fear. Now, faced with the young wife's condition, that fear shifted. She spoke carefully, revealing small details, unusual requests, strange confidence, talk of outcomes that sounded final. The crowd stiffened, the air growing tight. The mother-in-law's control slipped further. Her anger flared, her words spilling faster, harsher. She accused everyone of turning against her, of forgetting her sacrifices, of choosing an outsider over blood. The more she spoke, the more her mask fell away. What was meant to remain hidden now stood dangerously close to the surface. The young wife swayed, nearly collapsing, caught just in time by her husband. As he held her, the weight of everything pressed down on him. The silence, the loyalty, the cost of waiting too long. The crowd watched closely, knowing they stood on the edge of a truth that could no longer be pushed back into the dark. And yet, even now, nothing was fully revealed. The bowl remained untouched, the intentions unspoken, the final proof just out of reach. The night had brought voices together, but the real confrontation still waited ahead. What would be uncovered next would not only decide the young wife's fate, but would expose just how far cruelty can go when power is left unchecked. The moment stretched painfully as the young wife leaned against her husband, her weight light in his arms. He felt fear like he had never felt before. Not the fear of losing respect or upsetting his mother, but the fear of losing the woman he loved. He looked down at her face, pale and exhausted, and something inside him finally broke. In that instant, years of silence and hesitation collapsed under the weight of truth. He turned to his mother, his voice shaking but firm. He asked her to explain the bowl, the whispers, the fear that had taken over his home. The compound was silent now, every ear listening. For the first time, the mother-in-law had no easy answer. She tried to speak, but her words tangled together, anger and panic fighting for control. The calm authority she once carried slipped away, leaving only a desperate woman cornered by her own actions. The elderly neighbor stepped forward, slowly but confidently. She spoke of old signs, of patterns she had seen before in other families, stories that ended in regret and shame. She did not accuse directly, but her words were clear enough. The relative who had spoken earlier added more details, enough to paint a picture no one could ignore. Piece by piece, the truth formed, not through shouting but through shared courage. The husband made a decision that changed everything. He ordered that no one touch the bowl. He sent for the village healer and elders, insisting the matter be handled openly. This was no longer a private family issue. It was a question of safety, of trust, of how power had been used inside his home. The mother-in-law protested loudly, calling it betrayal, but her voice no longer held the same strength. When the healer arrived, she examined the young wife carefully. She spoke calmly, explaining that prolonged stress, fear and harmful substances, even in small amounts, could weaken the body over time. Nothing was said harshly, but the implication was clear. The compound buzzed with quiet shock. What many had feared was now being spoken aloud, carefully, responsibly, without drama but with undeniable weight. The mother-in-law collapsed onto a stool, her anger draining into something else. Fear, regret, or perhaps the realization that her control had finally slipped beyond her reach. She began to cry, not the quiet tears of sorrow but loud, shaking sobs. She spoke of loneliness, of fear of being forgotten, of believing she had to fight to keep her place. Her confession did not excuse her actions, but it revealed the emptiness that had driven them. The elders spoke among themselves before delivering a judgment meant to protect, not destroy. The young wife would be taken to her family to recover, away from the compound. The mother-in-law would no longer hold authority over the household. Boundaries were set, watched closely by the community. It was not revenge. It was accountability. And for the first time, the young wife felt something close to relief. As she was led away, supported by her husband and watched by the villagers, many believed the story had reached its end. The evil exposed. The victims saved. Justice in its quiet form served. But life rarely closes its stories so neatly. Weeks later, as the young wife slowly regained her strength in her family's care, news reached the village. The mother-in-law had fallen ill. Some said it was stress. Others whispered of guilt finally catching up with her body. She grew weak, withdrawn, no longer the powerful figure she once was. The compound that once echoed with her commands now sat quiet. Before her passing, she asked to see her son alone. What she told him was something no one expected. She confessed that she had once suffered under a cruel mother-in-law herself, a pain she had never healed from. Instead of breaking the cycle, she had continued it, believing control was the same as strength. Her final words were not excuses but a warning, to never let unhealed wounds become weapons. When she was gone, the village reflected in silence. Some felt pity. Others felt anger. But most felt the heavy truth of the story settle into their hearts. The young wife returned later, not to the same life, but to a changed one. Her husband stood by her openly now, his loyalty no longer divided by fear. Yet the final twist came quietly, almost unnoticed. One evening, the young wife sat alone and realized something unsettling. The fear she carried had not fully left her. Healing would take time. Survival had saved her body, but her spirit bore scars that would not fade easily. The story had ended, but its impact lived on. And that is where this tale truly rests, not in punishment or victory, but in the reminder that evil does not always look like a monster, and endurance does not always mean strength. Sometimes, the greatest twist is realizing that survival is only the beginning, and the cost of silence can echo long after the danger is gone. Time moved differently after everything that happened. It did not rush forward the way everyone expected. Instead, it slowed, giving each person space to sit with what had been said, what had been done, and what could never be taken back. The young wife stayed with her family longer than planned, not because her body was still weak, but because her heart needed rest. Each morning she woke to familiar voices and gentle care, and slowly the tightness in her chest began to loosen. Her husband visited often. At first their conversations were quiet and careful, like people learning to walk again after a long fall. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was not to defend himself, but to admit his mistakes. He told her how fear had blinded him, how loyalty had confused him, and how silence had nearly cost him everything. He did not ask for forgiveness right away. He understood that trust, once shaken, needs time to rebuild. The young wife appreciated that. She spoke honestly about her pain, about the nights she had cried silently, about the fear that had followed her even into sleep. Saying the words out loud was hard, but it also lifted a weight she had carried alone for too long. Her family listened without judgment, reminding her that endurance should never mean accepting harm. In those moments she began to understand that strength is not only about surviving, but also about speaking when silence becomes dangerous. Back in the village, life continued but not unchanged. The compound felt different without the mother-in-law's presence. The quiet there was no longer heavy with fear, but it was not peaceful either. It carried the echo of lessons learned too late. Neighbors spoke more openly now, reflecting on how easily they had looked away. Some felt guilt for staying silent. Others promised themselves they would not ignore warning signs again. The story had become more than a family matter. It was now a shared memory, a reminder. The elderly neighbor who had tried to warn the young wife became someone people listened to more closely. Her words carried new weight. The young girl who had run into the compound that night was praised quietly for her courage. Though she still felt afraid sometimes, she knew her voice had mattered. That knowledge stayed with her, shaping the woman she would one day become. When the young wife finally returned to the village, it was on her own terms. She did not rush back into the old routines. Together with her husband, she set clear boundaries. They moved into a separate space, small but peaceful. The elders supported the decision, understanding that distance was part of healing. The young wife was no longer just a daughter-in-law expected to endure. She was a woman whose voice had been heard. Healing, however, was not simple. Some days were better than others. There were moments when a raised voice made her flinch, or when silence felt threatening instead of calm. Her husband noticed and learned to be patient. He learned that love is not proven by words alone, but by consistency, protection, and change. Slowly, trust began to grow again, not as it once was, but stronger in a different way. Questions lingered, especially about the mother-in-law. People wondered if things could have ended differently. Some said she was a victim of her own past. Others believed pain does not excuse cruelty. The truth sat somewhere in between. Her story became a warning passed quietly among women and men alike, that unhealed wounds can turn into weapons, and that power without compassion can destroy families. The young wife often reflected on that truth. She did not celebrate what happened, but she did not deny it either. She chose to learn from it. She began speaking with other women, sharing her experience gently without bitterness. She told them that patience is valuable, but it should never cost one's safety or dignity. Her words reached people who needed them, planting seeds of awareness that would grow long after the story faded from gossip. As seasons passed, laughter slowly returned to her life. Not the careless laughter of before, but something deeper, earned. She learned to enjoy simple moments again. Morning sunlight, shared meals, quiet conversations. Her strength returned, not just to her body but to her spirit. The fear that once ruled her no longer had the same power. Her husband changed too. He became more aware, more present. He no longer avoided conflict when it mattered. He learned that protecting family sometimes means standing up to it. That lesson stayed with him, shaping every decision he made afterward. He knew that love, once tested, must be guarded carefully. The village moved forward, carrying the story with it like a scar and a lesson combined. Parents spoke to their children about kindness and control. Elders reminded each other that authority should never be used to harm. The story of the evil mother-in-law was no longer told with excitement or fear, but with reflection. It became a folktale of consequence, not just cruelty. In the end, there was no perfect ending. Some wounds remained tender. Some questions had no clear answers. But there was growth, awareness, and change, and sometimes, that is the most honest resolution life offers. The young wife stood one evening at the edge of the compound, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was calm. For the first time in a long while, she felt present, not trapped between past and fear. She knew her journey was not defined by what she suffered, but by what she chose afterward. And as the night settled gently over the village, her story closed not with darkness, but with a quiet truth. Endurance may keep you alive, but courage, voice, and community are what truly set you free.